Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. If you guys haven't heard, there's a little show that recently finished up a few weeks ago on AMC called NOS4A2, and today we are continuing our series and we're going to do a spoiler-free review of the entire first season of NOS4A2.
So if you haven't been following along, this is actually our fourth video in this NOS4A2 series. We have a spoiler-free book review and 2 spoiler-filled reading vlogs. We will link the playlist for you guys if you are interested in those and want to check them out.
And the reason we've done a whole series on this, if you've been around the channel, we love book-to-movie, book-to-TV show adaptations, and this is one of our favorite books. This is based on a book by Joe Hill called NOS4A2 of the same name. It is a horror thriller with supernatural elements, and it is a lot of fun, and so we are very excited for this TV show when we heard that it was happening.
So for those of you unfamiliar with the storyline, this follows Victoria McQueen and a villain named Charlie Manx, and both of them have some special abilities that you discover along the way, and Charlie is after Victoria for her abilities, essentially, and lots of hijinks and shenanigans ensue. There are a ton of horror elements in this. NOS4A2 implies that, but it's one of the most unique synopsises I've ever read of a book and TV show ever. It's just very interesting, but hard to explain without being spoilery.
So we're going to dive into the plot of this first season. We're not going to talk about specific details, so you're not going to get spoiled. And this starts pretty interesting. It starts pretty slow. We pick up with Vic, which is our main character, and she discovers her powers pretty early on in the show. It really jumps into things pretty fast, and then I think it slowly peters out. I felt like the plot of this show was a little interesting because the way they moved through the story sometimes felt very fast-paced and then also felt very slow-paced. And I almost felt like plot-wise there was quite a bit of like filler stuff.
I think a big reason we have a lot of slowdowns in this show is because the source material is not the entirety of this season 1. The source material is over 600 pages of a book, and it's really only covering, this first season is really only covering the first third of the book. So they had to kind of slow some things down, and they did add some extra elements and some extra side storylines along the way to kind of beef up the show in that regard. But I think that honestly, I saw a lot of reactions online from the first 2 episodes that it was a little too slow and losing people's interest, and it took till I think about the 4th episode to kind of start picking back up again after the first one.
Yeah, I really felt like they just didn't know quite which storylines to spend the most time on, and I think that this show really becomes a slog when it gets caught up in the character drama. Even though the characters did a good job, which we'll talk about in a minute, I feel like it was much more interesting when it was getting into the world building and the powers and their special abilities and how all that stuff ties together. I think it was a much more interesting subplot that it almost felt like the show didn't want to go there a lot of episodes, which I think just made it not always as exciting as it could be.
So kicking off character discussions, I want to talk about Ashley Cummings, who plays our titular character, Victoria McQueen. Ashley Cummings is someone I've never seen in anything before, at least that I'm aware of, and she also looks very different than anything she's been in because they completely changed her look for this show, and I think she was a phenomenal pick for this role. I was a little hesitant about it at first just because I didn't know her or her skills and previous experience, but I think she did a really good job portraying Vic as the way that she was written for the show, which is a bit different personality-wise from the book, but I think for the way that she was written, she did a really fantastic job. And in particular, the 2-part finale, there is a scene in that finale that, like, I think she deserves awards for. It was phenomenal and just really, like, pushed her acting ability, and I think she incredibly succeeded.
Then we have another leading lady, Jakara Smith. She plays Maggie in this, and another big character. Her role is actually expanded in the show. She gets a lot more screen time than I think she gets page time in the novel, and I really liked it. I liked the way she had an expanded role. I liked the way that they built into her and Vic's relationship and friendship, and I think that Jakara did a really good job with all that extra screen time. I think she holds her own with Ashley Cummings, and she in particular also has some tough scenes to act through that I think she does a really good job showing a lot of emotion that's pretty high caliber for a television show.
She also plays a very, like, multi-layered character who, like, even at the end of season 1, we still don't fully understand. So I think that she pulled off all the facets of that very well. And then we have our villain, Charlie Manx, who is played by Zachary Quinto. Now, if you've seen anything Zachary Quinto's been in before, especially his villainous roles, Heroes, he was well, no, he wasn't really a villain in American Horror Story. He was just an unlikable person. He's played villains before, and he's very, very good at them, and I think that he was a very good choice for this. Charlie Manx is a character who goes through a lot of transformations, and I think that Zachary Quinto played all of those very well. He has to do a lot of different things with this character. It's not a one-dimensional villain. If you've watched our previous videos talking about the book, it's one of my favorite villains of all time, and I think that he portrayed the character very well and was very formidable and foreboding in the way that he was written for the show.
I feel like they really nail the skeevy factor with him. Zachary Quinto does a really good job with that, which is just sometimes a hard thing to nail with like a villain, but you just feel like icky every time he's on screen. As well, I felt like the supporting cast did a really good job. I felt like they held their own, and there's some bigger characters and some smaller ones that may have expanded roles later that get introduced, and some of those are kind of spoilery, so we won't jump into them. But I felt like overall all the performances on this show were really good and really strong, despite the plot sometimes slowing down. If it weren't for the excellent performances, it probably would have been even worse, you know?
So we already mentioned this a little bit when discussing the plot earlier, but the pacing in the show is pretty much my biggest complaint about this first season of this show. The pacing in the book is very quick and a lot of things are happening, but without overwhelming you with too much action. It's just pretty fast moving, whereas this show was very slow, especially for the first half of the season. The second half of the season really started to pick up and got very, very interesting. But for a show that is based on source material that honestly a lot of people are not familiar with, and especially on a TV channel like AMC that has like more of a niche audience, I just think that it was a poor decision to make the first half of the season with very interesting world building and very interesting concepts that have not been done before in this way. To make it slow and not pull you in quite as much as it could have or should have, I think was an ultimate mistake on the part of the writers or showrunners or whoever made that decision.
Which brings me to something I want to talk about, which is, I call it the AMC effect. I don't know if it's like the higher up executives who control all like the ultimate decisions on the shows and stuff, but they always seem very determined. Almost every show on AMC nowadays is very like slow burn-esque, and I don't know why they're so like hell-bent on having the show be so slow and to slowly drip feed you out the interesting aspects of the plot. And it honestly feels like sometimes they're like stuffing filler, and even in scenes where you didn't need it to, they'll do like little things like actually slow down the amount of dialogue that you have. So like they'll put like 3 to 4 second gaps in between people responding, which is not how people talk. If two people have a conversation, they just say what they want to say. They don't like, hey, I need to talk to you. But like that happens a lot in this show, and it's one of the reasons I stopped watching The Walking Dead. And it's one of the problems I had with the final season of Game of Thrones is there's whole scenes where they just spend like 30 seconds like just moving around a scene before they start talking. And it really grates on you after a little while, especially once you notice it.
It's one of those things where I understand the reasoning behind it, especially with the tone of this show. It is supposed to be this like creeping, foreboding. For those of you unfamiliar, Joe Hill is Stephen King's son, and he takes a lot of influence from his father's writing and the way he does things, but he's completely his own author who is very unique. But there is some influence there, especially because this book involves some Stephen King references. So I think that they were kind of playing into the whole like creepy towns, sleepy setting, like foreboding, like Maine setting kind of thing, but I just think it was a little too much on the slowness and just sloggy pacing.
I feel like excellent horror has the ability to vacillate between that slow, foreboding creep and to have lighter moments as well. And this show sometimes had that, but it always had almost like that, like tint of gray over everything. Even when something good was happening, there's always was something trying to like creep in the background to slow it down.
Now, this is a pilot season, so that could also be a factor. I really do think the second half of the season really hit its stride with its pacing. I think it was much better in the second half. I think it fit the tone a lot better. So maybe that's something that they will carry into the next seasons because this has been renewed. Now, we are going to have a full video that will have a deep dive analysis of the book to movie adaptation aspects of this series, and it will be spoiler filled. So that's coming. We don't really want to touch on too much of that in this video, but just to shortly give you an idea of our thoughts as a book to TV show adaptation. Overall, I think it's a good adaptation. I think the characters are pretty true to the characters in the book, besides Vic McQueen being a little different. And then I think that the tone is very accurate for the most part, and obviously the plot's very similar. They really didn't change up too much of the plot. There's a little bit towards the end of season 1 that we'll talk about in our analysis video that's very different and will have an effect later. But I think it was a really good adaptation from the book. I think that they did a good job of tweaking some things to make it interesting for people who are familiar with the source material while still being faithful to it.
So overall, I think that this is a show worth watching, especially if you're a fan of the book. But if you've never seen or read the previous novel and you have no experience with this like franchise, it's one thing, it's not really a franchise, but I think it's worth your time. It is good. Like we said, the beginning is a little bit of a slog, but it is such a unique concept and world, and the performances are really good that I think it's worth slogging through those to get through to the back half, back 2/3 of the series when it really hits its stride and grows on you. And it has already been renewed for a season 2, so we know we're gonna continue that story and get more of it. And overall, I think we enjoyed it.
So let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you watched the TV show? Do you agree with us? And let us know if you've read the book as well, and go watch our book-related videos regarding this series. Subscribe if you want to see more videos from us. Like I said, we will have one more video coming in the series. We do a lot of other book to movie adaptations, as well as a lot of other different types of videos on this channel. So go check it out, subscribe if you're interested, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and we will see you in our next one. Bye guys.